Welcome to the deep dive. So, you've handed us this stack of sources, articles, notes, all sorts of insights, and our job, well, our favorite job, is to dive in
Yeah, pull out the key stuff, connect those dots.
and then hand you back the clearest possible picture.
Exactly. Think of it like getting the ultimate shortcut. You get genuinely well-informed on something pretty complex without wading through hours of dense material yourself.
We try to zero in on what really matters and why it matters to you. And today, we are plunging, head first into a really significant development, something unfolding right now in Kerala, India.
That's right. On June 10th, 2025, this major directive came down from the state government in Thiruvananthapuram.
And this wasn't just, another piece of paper.
No, not at all. This order, it fundamentally changes how things work, right down to the local level.
Okay.
It's telling the local governing bodies, the municipalities, the village panchayats, the city corporations across the whole state, that for their infrastructure, projects their roads, community buildings, drainage systems, all that stuff, they need to find their own money.
Wow. Okay. So the mission for this deep dive is really to unpack the weight of that. Why is the state doing this now?
Right. What does this new approach actually look like on the ground?
And crucially, what are the massive challenges here? And maybe opportunities too, not just for these local bodies, but for you listening to understand where local development and governance might be heading.
Precisely. It's not just tweaking the finances. It could be a whole new way of doing things. A paradigm shift, really.
Okay, let's get into it. So at the heart of this, you have Kerala's system of local self-governments, the LSGs.
These are the grassroots level. Village panchayats, municipalities, city corporations. They're the government closest to the people.
And for decades, how did they fund their local projects like roads and bridges?
Well, the lifeblood, especially for infrastructure, was funding allocated straight from the state government. We call these clan funds.
Clan funds, okay.
Yeah, it was a pretty consistent source, something they could, generally rely on to get things built or fixed in their area.
Right. So you could sort of picture it, maybe. An LSG needs a new playground, or a bridge needs fixing. They'd look to the state capital for the cash.
Pretty much, like a kid asking for pocket money for projects.
Okay, I get that analogy.
But this directive, the one from Juneteenth, it just rips up that old script.
Completely.
That's a very clear signal. The state is stepping back, significantly reducing its direct financial role for a lot of these local infrastructure projects.
And this applies across the board to all the different types of local bodies.
Yes, exactly. The sources are specific. We're talking all 941 gram panchayats, the 87 municipalities, and the 6 big city corporations, all 1,034 of them.
Wow.
The expectation now is they've got to be much more proactive, tapping into external, non-state sources.
And those sources are mainly?
The directive specifically highlights two: private contributions and corporate social responsibility CSR funds.
So going back to that pocket money analogy, the state's now saying.
Okay, LSGs, you're not kids anymore. You're grown up.
Right.
That allowance, well, it isn't guaranteed like before. Time to find your own income. Pay for your own development.
That is a fundamental change in the relationship, the responsibility, everything.
It truly is. And understanding why this big shift now, that's key. Because this isn't happening in a vacuum.
No, it sounds like it's tied to Kerala's financial situation.
Absolutely. It's a direct result of the, frankly, very difficult financial spot the state is in.
We've seen reports on this. Kerala's been dealing with a pretty serious fiscal crisis, right?
Yeah.
Mounting debts, treasury controls.
Yeah, and even things people notice, like delays in Social Security pension payments sometimes.
Yeah.
That points to real cash flow issues.
And wasn't there something earlier, like back in mid-2024, about KIFB?
Good point. Yes. Back in May 2024, sources were saying the state was actually considering winding up KIFB, the Kerala Infrastructure Investment Fund Board.
KIFB. Isn't that the main way the state funds its really big infrastructure projects, often using off-budget borrowing?
Exactly that. KIFB is supposed to be the big engine for these large-scale transformations. So the fact that winding it up was even, discussed because of financial stress.
That says a lot.
It paints a really stark picture. It's like considering canceling your main credit line for big purchases because you're struggling to afford the daily essentials. The state is feeling seriously squeezed.
And the budget figures we have seem to confirm this squeeze.
They do. The total planned budget outlay for 2024-25 was huge, around 38,886 crore. But by early 2025, the actual spending on those planned items was way behind schedule. Only about 41% had actually been spent. slower than the year before even.
And that affected the LSGs, too, their share of the spending.
Yes, their specific allocation was about 8,532 crore for local plans. But their spending was also lagging, only around 45% spent by early 2025.
So maybe issues with getting funds out or maybe capacity to spend it, or both.
Could be a mix of factors. But the state government also points a finger, outwards.
Ah, right, the political dimension. The
Yeah.
sources mention that.
Exactly. The state leadership has been very vocal, alleging what they call political discrimination in how funds are allocated from the central government.
They feel they're not getting their fair share, especially in the latest union budget.
That's their stated position, yeah. They feel shortchanged.
And there was that quote from Union Minister George Kurian suggesting Kerala was maybe playing up its financial woes.
Yeah, the sources mentioned his remark about Kerala perhaps declaring itself backward to try and secure more central funds.
Okay, so there's definitely political tension there.
Right. And look, we're not taking sides here, just reporting what the sources say. But the effect of this perception is clear. The state feels constrained by funds coming from the center.
So you combine the internal fiscal pressure, the debt, the spending lag,
With this perceived squeeze on central funds.
and the logic behind telling the LSGs you need to find other money becomes much clearer.
Exactly. The state's basically saying, look, our usual wells are running low or are blocked. We just can't fund everything locally like we used to. You guys, the LSGs, you're right there. You see the local businesses, the wealthy individuals, the companies operating nearby. It's time for you to tap those resources.
It's a pivot, born out of necessity, it sounds like.
Definitely. And the sources clearly point to these two specific new wells, CSR funds and private contributions.
Okay, let's dig into CSR first. Corporate social responsibility. What exactly does that mean here?
Okay, so under India's Companies Act, certain bigger companies, based on profit or net worth, have to spend 2% of their average net profits on CSR activities. It's mandated social spending.
Right, money they have to spend anyway, usually on things like what? Education, environment, poverty relief.
Exactly. And the state government is now telling LSGs very clearly, go pitch projects that fit these CSR rules.
So theoretically, this could fund a lot of local stuff, road repairs, a community center, maybe upgrading a local clinic, drainage.
Potentially, yes. Huge range. But, and this is a big but,
Uh-huh.
getting that CSR money for, say, a fairly mundane local infrastructure project. That's tough.
Why's that?
Well, companies often want bang for their buck, PR-wise. They might prefer sponsoring a big, visible festival or building a shiny new school with their name on it.
Rather than fixing a leaky drainage pipe on some back road?
Precisely. It might be just as critical, maybe even more so, but it's less glamorous, less visible.
So the LSGs, they basically have to become slick sales teams now, convincing corporates that their local, maybe unsexy project is the best use of that CSR money.
That's a huge part of the challenge, and it leads right into the second pillar, private contributions.
Okay, so this is just asking people for money.
Essentially, yes. LSGs need to actively solicit donations directly from individuals.
Who are they likely targeting? Wealthy locals.
It could be a mix. Wealthy families living there, successful local business owners, and crucially, the sources highlight non-resident Indians, NRIs.
Ah, the diaspora. Kerala has a huge global diaspora, right?
Massive. Estimated around 2.5 million people, 25 lakh. Many still have strong ties back home, strong roots in specific villages or towns. They're seen as a major potential source of philanthropic funding.
But again, you've got local officials, panchayat presidents, municipal staff. Their job is usually admin, public services.
Exactly.
Now they're supposed to become fundraisers, making calls, maybe knocking on doors. Excuse me, sir, Madam Lovely House. Any chance you could chip in a lakh for this culvert repair?
It feels awkward just saying it. It requires a totally different skill set, confidence, negotiation skills.
And what about keeping track of all this? If private money starts flowing in for public projects, how do you make sure it's used properly? Prevent misuse?
That's a massive question. The sources say oversight mechanisms are promised, but there's definite skepticism about how robust or effective that will be in practice, especially across over 1,000 different local bodies.
So, okay, potential new funding streams, CSR, and private donations. But big questions about the skills needed to get them and the systems needed to manage them.
Absolutely, it's complex. And it's not just about cash donations. There's another piece the sources mentioned, something introduced a bit earlier in 2025, that fits into this whole picture. Land pooling,
Land pooling. Okay, how does that fit in? How does pooling land help fund infrastructure?
Right, so the idea here is to take all these scattered plots of land owned by various government departments, state agencies, and even the LSGs themselves.
And consolidate them, bring them together.
Exactly. Merge these fragmented public land holdings into larger, more usable blocks. The main goal is to tackle one of Kerala's biggest hurdles for attracting major investment.
Land scarcity and the sky-high cost of land.
Precisely. It's notoriously difficult and expensive to assemble large tracts for, say, a factory or an industrial park in Kerala.
So pooling existing public land makes it easier, creates ready-made parcels.
That's the aim. Make it simpler and cheaper for big investors. The state budget for 2025-26 actually highlighted land pooling as a key strategy for this.
Okay, but how does that directly fund, like, a local road or bridge?
It's a bit more indirect. By making it easier to attract those large projects. Think industrial parks, big logistics hubs like around the Vizhinjam port.
Which has those huge ambitions, right? Competing with Singapore or Dubai.
Exactly. Having large, ready parcels nearby makes it easier to build the supporting infrastructure for those hubs and attracts the businesses who will use them. The value generated from developing that pooled land could then potentially flow back.
So maybe the LSG that contributed land gets a share or some revenue.
Something like that. The sources mention a new special purpose vehicle, an SPV, being set up for this, with an initial 1,000 crore from KIFB, interestingly.
Ah, KFB again.
Yes. And development could happen publicly, privately, or via this SPV. The mechanism mentioned allows original owners, potentially including LSGs, to retain their assets while monetizing their properties.
So basically, you put your land into the pot, it helps attract a big project, and you get some benefit back that you can then use for your own local needs, leveraging assets.
Exactly. It's another angle, another sort of creative financing approach layered on top of the push for CSR and direct donations.
But all these ideas, CSR, donations, land pooling, they sound great in theory.
But the sources immediately flag some major challenges on the ground.
Yeah, what's the first big one?
The sheer inequality between the LSGs themselves. It's not a level playing field.
How so?
Well, think about it. Kerala's diverse.
Yeah.
You've got major cities like Kochi and Thiruvananthapuram, bustling economic centers. And then you have very rural, sometimes remote, panchayats in places like Wayanad or Idukki.
Right. The capacity to attract funds must be vastly different.
Absolutely. A corporation in Kochi. It's surrounded by large companies, potential CSR donors, wealthy individuals, probably lots of well-off NRIs with connections there.
Much easier to make that pitch.
Compared to a small rural panchayat in the hills,
Yeah.
where the local economy is maybe agriculture-based, fewer large businesses, maybe less access to wealthy donors.
It's going to be much, much harder for them.
Exactly. So this new directive, while trying to solve the state's funding problem, could actually end up making the development gap wider between the richer and poorer LSGs. You could see infrastructure quality diverging even more across the state.
That's a really serious potential consequence. And it links to the other big challenge, right? The skills gap.
Yes, the human expertise needed inside these LSGs.
Most local government staff, they're administrators, they manage public services, handle existing grants.
They're not typically trained fundraisers or corporate negotiators
Hmm.
or experts in structuring complex donation schemes or land development deals.
Someone used the analogy, like asking a skilled toddy tapper to suddenly start coding an app.
That's a perfect way to put it. The skill sets are just fundamentally different.
So if this is going to work, these LSGs need serious support, right? Training, guidance.
Absolutely crucial. But the sources point out that, as of now, there isn't much detail on state plans for this kind of specialized capacity building. It feels a bit like they've been told what to do, but not how. Like, here's the deep end, now figure out how to swim.
And in Kerala, you always have to consider the public reaction. People are very engaged, very vocal about local issues.
Oh, definitely. Remember the controversy back in 2023? During the Nava Kerala Sada's outreach program?
Vaguely. What happened?
Critics were really upset because LSGs were apparently asked to use their own limited funds for some rally-related expenses. It was seen as an unfair burden.
Okay. Now, this new directive is focused on external funds, private, CSR not necessarily dipping into the LSG's existing budget, so maybe it avoids that specific flashpoint.
Potentially. But if the infrastructure doesn't get built, if the roads stay potholed because the LSG couldn't raise the private funds.
Then people will be just as angry, surely. They'll ask, where's the development we were promised?
Exactly. If state funding is cut back and these new methods don't fill the gap, it directly impacts people's lives and services. Public frustration is also guaranteed.
So this is much more than just a financial memo. It's potentially changing the whole understanding of who pays for local development. And it's all happening while Kerala has these huge statewide infrastructure ambitions.
Yes, you absolutely have to see this local shift against that bigger backdrop. The state isn't thinking small. It has these grand plans to really transform its infrastructure landscape, aiming for completion around 2027.
We're talking massive projects, upgrading National Highway 66.
The Vizhinjam port completion and expansion.
Plans for that new greenfield airport near Sabarimala.
That really challenging Anakanpoil-Kaladi-Mapiti tunnel through the Ghats.
And the big water transport and urban regeneration project in Kochi.
Yeah, these are multi-crore initiatives aimed at boosting connectivity, logistics, quality of life, really raising Kerala's profile.
And KRFB was supposed to be the main funding vehicle for all this.
It was. Sources say KRFB approved something like 82,383 crore for over 1,000 projects. Huge numbers.
But as we said, KIFB itself has faced headwinds, right? Scrutiny over its funding model, off-budget borrowing concerns from the ED, the CAG.
Exactly. So let's recap the context. State government under financial pressure perceives issues getting funds from the center. Its main infrastructure funding body, KIAFB, is facing controversy.
It really does sound like a perfect storm.
It does. And that storm seems to be forcing the state to look for these, let's call them creative solutions, not just for the mega projects, but now explicitly pushing that need for creativity, that responsibility, down to the 1,000+ local bodies.
It's a huge thing to ask. And the sources even had some, well, let's say slightly lighthearted takes on how LSGs might actually do this fundraising in practice.
Yes, they did add a touch of local reality, maybe even humor, to this very serious challenge, like LSGs hosting fundraising galas.
Yeah, complete with coconut water cocktails, a live band, maybe hoping a Mollywood star drops by to loosen the purse strings of wealthy donors.
Or launching crowdfunding campaigns online. Pave My Village Drive, maybe. Offering, like, quirky rewards. Name a pothole after a donor for a big contribution.
That's funny. And definitely leaning on the NRI connection.
Oh, yeah. Actively trying to befriend an NRI from the area. Recognizing that massive potential among the 2.5 million Keralites abroad who might feel generous towards their hometown.
And the CSR charm offensive.
Sending out the most charismatic council members.
Yeah.
Maybe armed with banana chips as a friendly offering.
Paints a picture.
Or, the last resort mentioned, just praying for miracles or generous donors to appear.
It really highlights how different this is, right? Asking these traditional admin bodies to suddenly act like nonprofits or tech startups scrambling for funding. It's a world away from managing state grants.
Completely. So let's try and wrap this up. This directive from June 10th, it's clearly a significant moment, a bold experiment, maybe even a gamble, driven by the state's tough financial situation.
Pushing the responsibility for funding local infrastructure squarely onto the LSGs.
And its success, it absolutely hinges on execution. Can these LSGs actually adapt? Can they build the relationships, develop the skills, and successfully tap these new funding streams?
Is there any reason for optimism? Did the sources mention any examples of LSGs succeeding in new ways?
There was a mention of the Clean Kerala Company initiative. Apparently, 800 LSGs got involved successfully in managing plastic waste. So it shows local bodies can mobilize and deliver when there's a clear model and goal.
Okay, that's
But
something.
funding big, expensive infrastructure projects is just a different beast than waste management. Different scale of money, different expertise needed.
So really what we're seeing is Kerala's local bodies being told to channel their inner MacGyver.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. They need to be incredibly resourceful. Look beyond the usual state funds, piece together money from corporate offices, from wealthy individuals, maybe leverage some land assets.
All to achieve that core goal. Keep infrastructure development moving because the state sees it as vital for the future.
But without digging the government itself into a deeper financial hole. The sources ended with those nice analogies about Kerala's resourcefulness, right? Turning coconut shells into art, fish curry into a global brand.
The hope being that this same ingenuity can somehow be applied to finding money for roads and bridges now.
That seems to be the underlying hope, yes.
Which brings us back to you, the listener. What does this really fundamental shift in funding responsibility mean? Whether you live in Kerala, follow its economy, or are just interested in how governments everywhere are trying to cope with funding challenges.
The huge question, the one you'll be able to watch play out in the coming months and years, is this. Can these local bodies, most with zero experience in this kind of fundraising or corporate dealing, actually step up? Can they generate the kind of serious money needed to keep local infrastructure developing?
It feels like a massive unknown, because if the state money shrinks, as planned, and these new private CSR land pooling ideas don't consistently bring in enough revenue, then what?
Yeah, what happens to those critical local projects? The roads, the bridges, the community facilities people rely on every day.
Does development just slow down dramatically in many areas, especially the less well-off ones, potentially worsening inequality?
Or does this pressure cooker situation actually force some truly innovative local bottom-up funding solutions to emerge? Could necessity really breed invention here, creating a new, more resilient model?
It's more than just a policy shift, isn't it? It's a real-time experiment in governance and finance, and you've basically got a front row seat.